Thank you, Mark. It's a great pleasure to be here at the ICD. It's good to have this type of exchange of views and discussions with a smaller but highly qualified audience to discuss those topics which are global, European, and German, as just mentioned, in an interdisciplinary way. Let me get the micro like this. I'm a professor, so I'm used to walking around, and if I walk too much, you can stop me. What I would like to do this morning is talk to you about those three areas just mentioned. This crisis, to me, is, or at the core of this crisis, is a paradox. And the paradox is that the crisis is global, but the responses thus far have been national. And what I would like to share with you is this assessment of the three levels, global, European, German, to find out what the deficiencies of crisis management were and what the implications are for thinking about capitalism, thinking about economic models, as it's said in the title, for the future. Let me start with the global level. You've probably heard yesterday already, I saw that Heiner Flassbeck was here, and he mentions this very often, but he's not the only one. The root cause of this crisis is a very important global imbalance in financial markets that started roughly 10, 11 years ago. And as long as this root cause is not solved or looked at, this crisis is not going to be over. And so I would like to start with the global level, tell you a little bit about those root causes of the crisis, how we could face this, share a few thoughts on the G20 process and its, in my view, insufficiencies or difficulties in dealing with that process, and then give you a few ideas of what I would do at the global level right now. The second part of this lecture would then focus at the European level. I'll give a few insights on what I think about crisis management at the European Union level, talk a bit, it's impossible not to do it, about Greece and the difficulties that Europe faces right now, and then also see what the European Union, in terms of its economic model, should do in the upcoming years. Finally, I'll then turn to Germany and talk with you a little bit also about crisis management in the German context, tell you what I think or why I think we have to talk about the end of the German model today, and then go a bit into the future of economic policy making in the German context. So let me start with those global imbalances and the difficulty that we still face in global financial markets. Today, and before the start of the crisis, China was buying US Treasury bonds or bills worth around $20,000 per second. Okay? Can you imagine? $20,000 per second. Those are capital flows going basically not only from China, but also from other Asian countries, Japan, to the US, and financing this large, sometimes I say party, in the American context. The flip side of this is a large amount of current account deficit or imbalances in the same way on the American side. A high level of debt, a high level of betting on future growth that was financed largely by Asian countries. And those global imbalances, as they're commonly called, are really one of the root causes of that crisis. Why? Well, simply, if you have one actor providing so much liquidity to financial markets, such as the, in particular, Chinese central bank, then this liquidity gets people to be able to make very cheap investments, to buy houses at this very cheap interest rate context, etc., etc. If I tell you that today, the average household debt of American households is $150,000, and the average income is only $60,000 per household per year, then you can see that we have this huge debt overhang in the American economy. Now, those imbalances between Asia and the United States are replicated at various other levels. We see other countries playing aggressively the intervention in those financial markets in order to undervalue their currencies and in order to get access via export-led growth to other markets. Those are, well, I mentioned Japan. We should also mention the oil-exporting countries that provided a lot of liquidity to the US and other economies. Germany should be singled out as a country that also exported a large amount of capital. Other economies played the same role, a similar role as the US, importing large amounts of capital and having this debt-driven economy. The UK, Spain, Greece, to some extent. Those are all countries betting on this future development and growth. Now, what the crisis then brought, and I'm not here to discuss with you the history of the financial crisis, is an end or a momentaneous interruption of those imbalances. And it then stopped. China stopped intervening in currency markets. The savings rate in the US went up. And it seemed to actually balance itself out. But now, the crisis seems to be coming to its end. We all mentioned that the crisis is over. And the same imbalances that we saw before now continue or have started again. China is again heavily, aggressively intervening in current account or foreign exchange markets. The savings rate in the US that was negative at the start of the crisis, so no savings at all, went up in the beginning of the crisis to 7%. So Americans got afraid and put money aside, which is to some extent the right way of reacting to that crisis. But as soon as they realized that the crisis was not as hard as they had expected, the savings rate fell yet again to around 2 to 3%, which is far too low. So my worry right now is that those imbalances and those difficulties in the global economy are still not really solved. We have gone back to normal, even if normal doesn't mean normal, but means something that is quite dangerous for the global economy. What have been the responses? That's my second point. At the global level to this type of imbalance. Well, those responses have really lacked. The G20 is focusing on a very large number of detailed reforms concerning banking regulation, concerning the instances of supervision, banking supervision, and prudential supervision, and drafting enormous, quite voluminous papers on how to deal with banks in difficulties. All this is not wrong. But I get the impression that they do not see, as we say in German, they do not see the wood, they just look at the different trees around them. And they're lost in that wood. They do not know where they're going. What I lack in this discussion is the strategy, the picture, which should get this world economy out of the crisis. And it is quite interesting that the G20 does not take up this challenge. It focuses on details and drafts those large documents. Just an example, the first Basel Accord was, I think, 20 pages long, and now they have just added pages to that, and it's now 300 pages long. Does this really prevent the world economy from a future crisis? I don't think so. I strongly believe that the relationship between banks and banking regulators is very similar to the relationship between professional sportsmen and the doping agencies. The doping agencies are always 5 years behind. As soon as they can detect an illegal substance, this substance is no longer used by a professional sports person. And so once they discover the new thing, the sports person is already 5 years ahead. And this is exactly the same relationship between banking regulators and banks. We are still now trying to respond to the Asian crisis that took place in the late 90s. The Basel Accord, which you've heard about, is a response to the Asian crisis. It was not yet implemented in the US when the new crisis erupted. So now we will spend the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps 5 years because we think it's urgent, we will spend the 5 next years to actually draft a new banking regulation document. But then the banks will find other ways to lose money. Banks have always found ways to lose money. So the response should rather be, which institutions do we need at the global level? Which type of flexible response to crisis developments should be designed at the global level? And this is where I would suggest that we should not spend as much time as we do right now looking at those detailed banking regulations, but really look at the broad picture. I would suggest a Secretariat for International Financial and Monetary Issues. We don't have that Secretariat. We have the International Monetary Fund, which has utterly failed in preventing crisis in the past. It didn't prevent the Latin American debt crisis in the 80s. It didn't prevent the Mexican crisis. It didn't prevent the Asian crisis. It didn't prevent the dot-com crash, it didn't prevent the current crisis, and so on and so on and so on. This fund is not capable of playing a supranational role in global monetary and financial relations. Why not? Because it's simply adding up national interests. Look at the institutional structure of the IMF. It has this board of directors representing individual countries. Now, the IMF was quite certain, for example, that Argentina in 2001 would go into a sovereign default. But they were not allowed to say that, because there was a clear veto of several people in the board not to make this public. So I think the IMF is excellent as a think tank. I love IMF data, and I love the publications they produce. But they're not the appropriate institution to play the warning system or watchdog at the global level for financial markets and monetary relations. Now, is there another possible institution? I don't think so. I would, although it's always bad to create a new institution, I would create this independent secretariat at the global level to actually develop an independent voice that can talk to governments, that can warn, and that can say, look, if the Chinese authorities continue what they're doing right now, and if the Americans are continuing what they're doing right now, then we will run directly into a new crisis. Who is saying this today? Academics? Journalists? But very few people actually involved in the discussions at the global level. So I think this is a very important step that should be tackled next. The G20 does not even have a secretariat. We have rotating presidencies preparing new agendas every 6 months, every year, and there's no real continuity. Supranational governance works when there is an independent actor trying to get supranational action to work. It worked in the European context when the Commission got independent around in the 1960s, 70s, and then actually pushed forward the Single European Act. It worked in the trade area to some extent, although many criticized the WTO, when the WTO was established. Because it's an independent institution that tries, with a clear mandate, to implement global free trade. You might disagree with whether this is the right mandate or not, but the institution as such, I think, is doing a good job. Think about security. We have the UN Security Council, which is also adding up national interests, but a good Secretary General of the United Nations can play a role as a voice in global security affairs. Where is this person in global economic and financial relations? We don't have that, and we should create this type of instance or body. However, and this gets me to my second big point, don't expect too much from the global level. Right now, politicians shift everything to the global level and say, well, we will deal with this in the G20 context. The Tobin tax, or taxes on financial markets. Why don't countries start to implement this nationally? Because they say if we do it alone, then we will lose market access. Fair enough. Then they say, let's shift it to the global level, because they know that it's not going to work at the global level. My question is, why don't you do it at the regional level? And here we are with my second big chapter on the European Union. The European Union is very interesting in this crisis. At the start of the crisis, the EU was completely absent. We share a currency in many countries of the European Union, and there was a lot of scope for the Commissioner of Financial Affairs to intervene. The Commission could have issued a directive or a regulation on financial markets, but they didn't. They just stayed absent. I think we should not blame them too much for staying absent, because they lacked the tools to really become active. We have created a monetary union in Europe that shares a single currency, but that does not include the appropriate governance mechanisms behind that allow us to confront a crisis like this one. And I think the crisis showed to us every single day the deficiencies of current economic integration in the European Union. So I think one could blame the EU for not taking up the chance they had in this specific moment to say, now let's build our own agenda in this crisis. They just said, it's not our competency, so let's stay passive. So one could blame the EU for this. during the first months of the crisis. But one should blame the EU for not taking action now. Now is the moment in time at which the EU should plan its new role for the next 5 to 10 years. And there are many possibilities. The EU budget right now is extremely small, as you might know. It's 1% of European GDP. I sometimes make the interesting comparison with the US federal budget before the 1929 crisis. It was 5% of GDP in the US context. After the crisis, the federal government devised the New Deal. And now the share of federal spending in the US is 30% of GDP. I'm not saying that we need a European budget of 30% of GDP. All I'm saying is we should think about what the EU can do as an economic actor and as the integrating part, as an almost economic government in running European finance, European fiscal policies. It is already running European monetary policy. So this picture, which is to some extent contradicting or is showing many possibilities, is now coming to the first page of your newspapers when we talk about Greece. Why is that? Well, because we simply realize we did the first step, but we didn't do the second step. We established a monetary union, but we didn't really find ways to tackle the fiscal difficulties of one country that free rides on all of the other countries. And that's the case of Greece. It's a country that did not communicate the right budgetary figures. It, put it bluntly, lied on the real state of its finances. It's a country that did not fully cooperate. And now we have the question, what do we do with that country? Do we save that country? Do we bail it out? Or do we actually say, well, it's your problem, so you do whatever you want. If you go into a bankruptcy, then you have to deal with that. None of the two answers is the right one. Obviously, we cannot let Greece go into bankruptcy because that would really hurt the European monetary union and it would hurt the euro. On the other hand, if we bailed out Greece today, what would be the consequence? The consequence would be that financial market participants in the future say, well, all of those countries here will be saved by the European Union if they behave badly. So we can invest in Greek government bonds the same way we invest in German government bonds because behind this is this European Union. I call this sometimes the Berlin fallacy. Why? Well, Berlin has been in bankruptcy since, or for the last 10 years. But Berlin still has access to to international capital markets at the status of AAA, which is the super safe status. Why? Well, because Berlin debt is guaranteed constitutionally by the German federal government. We don't want to have this at the European level. We don't want to have this explicit guarantee that we save countries. But what we want is some kind of correction mechanism that allows markets and countries to adjust to the difficulties they created themselves through bad policy making. But just this debate shows you how far we still have to go in the European context in order to find a right approach to economic policy making. And this is why I would advocate a very intensive discussion on economic governance in the European Union right now, right at the end, hopefully, of this crisis. What should be on the agenda? Well, what should be on the agenda is an encompassing approach to banking regulation at the European level. None of the European countries really tackled banking regulation in the past 12 months. They all said, if we do something against the banks, then they will all go to the US. What happened then? Barack Obama stepped forward with Paul Volcker and told the world, look, we have to go back to Glass-Steagall, the separation between commercial banking and investment banking. No one in Europe had ever suggested that, always saying, if we do something against the banks, they will all go to New York. And now it's the opposite happening. The Americans telling us what the right approach is to counter the bad policies of those banks. I would wish for a much stronger positioning of the European Union in this context, the same bold messages to say, let's cooperate with the Americans, let's cooperate with the Brits in order to really find a tight and flexible way of regulating banks. Let's not do this nationally. Let's do this at the European level. In the same way, we should also think about closer cooperation between governments at the European level to find out how the strategies of the different governments correspond to each other. Germany was running large fiscal or large current account imbalances, exporting money to other European countries. France was doing the exact opposite, importing a lot of money and importing many goods. This type of imbalance in the European context is almost as dangerous as the Chinese-American relationship at the global level. So let's use the European tools we have in order to think about a real agenda for economic policy making at the European Union level. This gets me then to my third large picture on which I would like to spend a little bit of time, which is Germany. How does Germany, in this crisis and after this crisis, fare in terms of its economic policy making? I'd like to start with a few remarks on crisis management in this country. I have not been impressed, and I think many others have not been impressed either. Paul Krugman once wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, which was entitled "The Economic Consequences of Mr. Steinberg." If you don't know who Mr. Steinberg is, it was our finance minister at the start of this crisis. If Paul Krugman writes an op-ed with this title in the New York Times, then things must be pretty bad. And there were. The thing is that crisis management in Germany was completely hands-off. They just decided not to intervene as aggressively in the economy as many other countries. Now they're saying things are okay because Germany has the most contradictory picture in terms of outcome in this crisis that you can imagine. We're the only country, basically, in the world or in the industrialized world in which unemployment rates have not increased during that crisis, which is quite impressive. No unemployment. On the other hand, we are the country that has been hit most badly in terms of GDP. Our GDP has declined by 5% in 2009. So there's a huge discrepancy. Usually, when GDP declines, unemployment should go up and vice versa. How come that there is this large difference between those two numbers? Well, first, I think bad crisis management and also Germany's role as the prime exporter in the world contributed greatly to the decline of GDP, which was so massive. We talk real money here. A difference of 5% of decline in GDP or just 1 or 2% is a very, very big difference. If you actually look at the rate of 5%, what it represents per capita in the German economy, then 5% of GDP is something like 1,200 euros per capita in the German economy. So I don't know how many Germans are in the room, but bad news for you, you all lost 1,200 euros in the past year. In terms of unemployment, the interesting, or I should say the second reason why Germany was hit so badly by this crisis is obviously as the prime exporter dependent on demand in other countries. And so since demand went down in those other countries, the first exporter in the world also had difficulties exporting its goods. How can we then explain this miracle in terms of the unemployment rate? Well, Germany adopted one of the smartest things that you could do in this crisis, which is the English word comes close to partial unemployment. The German word is Kurzarbeit. It basically implies that as a company, you do not lay off people. You keep them in the company, but you only pay a share of 20-30% of the salary, and the rest is taken over by, simply speaking, the government. So those people are then not unemployed. They stay in the company until the crisis is over. This has worked absolutely impressively during this crisis. Now the question is, will this last? And here I see a very negative development in the upcoming 3 to 4 months. Companies, since they still have to pay those 20 to 30% of the wage, cannot actually do this for a very, very long time. It's actually a short-term measure, and it was designed economically as a short-term measure. They now prolonged it to up to 24 months that you can have people in this partial unemployment scheme. But no company is able to actually keep those people in that status for such a long time. So in early summer, I would predict or anticipate German unemployment rates to go up. And then we will see the real picture of this crisis. Why do I say that German crisis management has been unimpressive? Well, first, we did 2 bank rescue packages, which completely failed. The first bank rescue package was used by 2 banks. One of them had just merged with another bank, Commerzbank, had just taken over Dresdner Bank. This is why they joined this bank rescue package, but all the other banks stayed outside. The second rescue package was the so-called bad bank scheme, which up to date has been used by 1 Landesbank in bankruptcy and 1 other bank, HRE, Hypo Real Estate, that is already nationalized. So they, in fact, don't need a bad bank approach. Why do I tell you this? I tell you this because the real problem in Germany is the banking system. German banks right now do not provide sufficient credit loans to the economy. Why do they do that? Or why don't they do that? Because they still have a large amount of toxic assets, non-performing assets in their balance sheets. Why are so many of those toxic assets on the balance sheets? Well, because German banks contributed greatly to this crisis by buying up those toxic assets. And they did not have a sufficient risk management or risk control allowing them, in the moment of a crisis, to respond by either selling them or getting them off their balance sheets. In all other countries with this type of problem, the UK, the US, and others, banks were either partially nationalized or own capital requirements of banks were increased. The only country that did not do that was Germany, or is Germany. Because the German government thinks that banks should settle this by themselves. Well, that's a way to go. But what's the implication of that? The implication is that if you have money coming into your bank account, into the account of the bank, so to speak, what do you do with that money? You do not use it to give loans to companies, but you use it to actually improve your own capital requirements. So you just keep the money. And this is what German banks do, and this is why we have a credit crunch in this country. There's not sufficient loan money available to the real economy. And this is, in my view, triggering a second reason why the year 2010 is not going to be a very good year. But the implications on Germany go beyond this short-term consideration. Germany in this crisis is really learning that the German model, which used to be a role model for economic management, is no longer performing the way it did in the past. Why is that? Well, look at the features of the German model that existed in the past. There was a very close relationship between banks and companies. The so-called Hausbanken-Prinzip, the principle of the bank that directly operates with firms, a very trust-based relationship. This relationship does no longer exist in capital markets that are global and that require from companies nothing different than a good credit rating from credit rating agencies. Second point is union involvement. Unions were and are still clearly involved in the management of companies. But companies realize today, when they're getting more global, that this is not making their flexibility or not increasing their flexibility. I'm not going to go into the details of whether I think unions should be part of it or not, but it's clear that the way it's done right now with a mandatory union participation in boards of companies, whether this is the right way to continue after this crisis. But what's most important are probably 3 other features. First, governments in the past, in this German model context, stayed hands-off. The government did not really engage in economic policy management. Fiscal activity or activism in Germany was not a role the German government took over. And it didn't do so really in this crisis. Because in a crisis, you go back to your Pavlovian reactions and to the way you solved things in the past. The second point is Germany was and is an export-oriented economy. I do not believe that this is the only way to get this country going. We now think we should go back to exports. We should lower wages in the economy in order to make ourselves more competitive. We have done so in the past 10 years. If we do so for another 10 years, then real wages in Germany are going to be so low that domestic consumption is no longer the engine it should be in an advanced industrialized country such as ours. The third point is that the whole system in the past only functioned because the Bundesbank was there to lower the inflation rate and to keep the German exchange rate at the level at which Germany could compete in international markets. Today, that's no longer possible. We have the European Central Bank, which is a great institution, which is doing a good job, but I always say it does the right monetary policy for a country that does not exist. It runs a monetary policy for 15, in the future perhaps 20 or 25 countries. There you can only look at averages. You cannot design a monetary policy or exchange rate policy for an individual country. And that's the German problem. If we now see a euro that will be appreciating when the dollar is going to decline, what we see right now due to the difficulties in the Greek economy is a temporary phenomenon. The future will show that the euro is going to rise. It will get a stronger currency. The Americans have every interest to actually inflate their economy to get rid of the debt problems, and then the dollar is going to decline. And that will hurt German exporters. So we should take the time now to think about a different growth model for the German economy. What could that growth model be? And I would like to conclude with that. I think we should devise an economic model that looks beyond exports. Obviously, the first step is to get the education system in Germany right. We want a knowledge-based economy. Now, I know you can't hear the word knowledge-based economy any longer because it's repeated by politicians, public servants, everyone. But as very often, if things are repeated very frequently, it's just true. Germany completely forgot to change its education system in the past 20 years. When I got my high school diploma, the Abitur, in Germany in 1994, only 28% of my age cohort also got the Abitur, which means that more than 70% do not get the Abitur, or at that time did not get the Abitur. The access to university is even lower than that. We declined to 10-12%. And if you look at the highly qualified people in the German economy, we talk about a very small share. This is not the economic model a country like Germany should adopt in a globalizing economy. It might sound trivial, but it's just true. And so let's get this right. And if I see the current government deciding on tax cuts that amount to 8.5 billion euros and go, you might have followed this, to hotels and also to some companies, and you then look at the amount of the federal spending on budget, on education and research, which is 10 billion euros in 1 year, we could have simply doubled our education expenses by avoiding the silly tax cut the German government has just agreed upon. And there you just realize that our priorities are wrongly listed. And if the politicians, the political sector doesn't get that right in the very near future, Germany is heading towards real difficulties. I also believe that we should prepare ourselves for an aging economy. The aging problem is enormous in Germany. We have to tackle the problems in the health sector. We have to tackle the problems in our tax system and social security contributions. If this is not done, again, in the next years, then by 2020, the German economy will be in a much more difficult situation than it is today. This gets me to my last word, which to some extent wraps it up. I also think that the future of Germany is with the European Union. I mentioned why I thought that the European Union right now was not sufficiently strong in giving momentum to the member countries and to the European economy as a whole. If we do not strengthen European actors, then the European Union will just stay a loose association of individual countries. I don't think that this is the right approach in an economy where we now see the G2 dominating the discussions, which is which is the US and China, and the European countries just play a side role. If we got organized at the European level, then we could be part in this discussion at the global level. What is required for that? Good and strong European politicians. You have heard about this Barroso person, probably. Not the strongest fighter for European issues. You probably have also heard about that other person, which is now heading the European Council. I forgot his name. Probably you also forgot his name. No, I know that's Van Rompuy. You might also have heard about that German commissioner going to Brussels. If you haven't, it's not surprising. His impact on the English-speaking world has been limited to a very funny YouTube video. So, coming to an end, I think this tour de force from global to European to German levels shows to you that it's all about governance. It's all about politics. It's all about institutions. If we don't get those institutions right in the upcoming 1, 2 to 3 years, then this crisis will not have had the effect I would have liked to see. And we would have to say that the crisis was too short to actually trigger real change. Thank you very much.